In 2015, Fujifilm launched their first professional zoom lens, the lens that gave birth, together to the 50-140, to the red badge zoom lenses lineup. That lens was the 16-55 f2.8 RLM-WR, their first f2.8 zoom lens that was aimed at professional and enthusiasts that wanted a constant f2.8 zoom. This zoom lens has been a staple in the Fujifilm lenses lineup because it's a great lens. It's sharp, it's got everything you can look for, and it's one of the best lenses that I've ever used. However, as I said in my review that you will find over here, or here, I don't remember, I never purchased this lens, and I never thought about purchasing this lens. And the reason is simple. As you can see, this lens is pretty big, but beyond the size, what concerned me about this lens was the weight. Because back then, the cameras that I was using, X-T2, X-T20, X-T3, X-T4, those cameras were not built for a lens like this. This lens was really, really too big and especially too heavy for those cameras. Handling those cameras one-handed with a lens like this would result in your wrist getting in pain pretty quickly. This lens weighs 655 grams, which is basically even more than some f2.8 24-70 full-frame lenses. So to me, it was a no-go. And if you, like me, consider the size and the weight as deal breaker for you, Fujifilm has listened to us. Enter the 16-55 f2.8 RLM-WR Mark II. With this new lens, Fujifilm addressed those concerns and then some. This brand new lens is built like all the top-of-the-line lenses that Fujifilm has launched in the last 3 or 4 years or so. I don't remember exactly when. It's built really, really well. Some say that this new version feels a little bit cheaper in the end than the previous version. I don't think this is the case. What I think is that the sheer difference in weight, which you're going to talk about in a second, tricks you into thinking that the previous version was built better. I don't have the same impression. It's just, to me, they're built very, very, very similarly. So those are just, in my opinion, just impression given by the sheer difference in weight. But let's just take a step back and talk about what Fujifilm has introduced for the first time with this lens. And what this is the aperture ring, which has always been there for the professional lenses in the Fujifilm lineup, is now giving you the chance to choose between a clicked aperture and a declicked aperture, meaning that usually the clicked aperture is for photography-oriented type of use, while the declicked aperture is more for video purposes, and more of that later. By only clicking on this switch on the side of the lens, you go from a clicked to a declicked aperture. The only thing that I can complain about this is that, especially since you're giving me the chance to have it clicked or declicked, I would like the clicked version of it to be stiffer. Because right now you can easily move, look, you can move it pretty easily. And to me, especially since I have the choice to going with a clickless aperture, I want to be a lot more deliberate into changing my aperture. Right now, you can change your aperture too easily, even without wanting to change it. So to me, it should have been a little bit stiffer. Again, especially since I have now the choice to be clicked or not clicked. For comparison, this is the previous version. It's much stiffer. It's much, much stiffer. And in my opinion, it should have been like that. This is the new one. Not a deal breaker, but something that was worth mentioning. Aside from the aperture ring, this lens got pretty much all the things that you've come to expect from a lens like this. While it is not stabilized, but this is pretty much the industry standard when it comes to f2.8 normal zoom lenses. The vast majority of them, especially from first party, they're not stabilized, so you've come to kind of expect that. But the lens is weather sealed. Yes, it extends while zooming, but again, this is typical of this type of lenses. Making it either stabilized or internal zooming would have made this lens bigger and for sure heavier. So nothing really to complain when it comes to reflection. The only thing that I can think of is that my copy is the zooming is a little bit looser on the wide end and becomes stiffer on the telephoto end. Not a big deal, not a deal breaker for sure, but something that was worth being mentioned. The star of the show here is the size, but more than the size is the weight. This lens weighs only 410 grams, while the previous version weighed 655. That means the new version is basically 2/3 of the weight of the previous one. And that is a huge, huge, huge difference. Especially when it comes to usability with Fujifilm cameras. Now, you can now use this lens on an X-H2, X-H2S, one-handed without feeling any tension on your wrist, without feeling the entire setup going towards the front and then putting some stress in your wrist. And also using it on the X-T50, which is a much smaller camera. The previous version of the lens, I would never use it on the X-T50. This one, I used it on the X-T50. While it's not as comfortable as using it on the X-H2S, of course, because the grip on the X-H2S is much bigger, is much more comfortable, it is still usable. It is now becoming an everyday carry lens, while in my opinion, the previous one was definitely far from being an everyday carry lens. So if the lens is good from an autofocus, optical standpoint, video standpoint, the sheer weight difference makes a huge, huge, huge impact on the usability of the lens. From an image quality standpoint, the new lens has some difficult shoes to fill because the previous version, as already mentioned, is a staple in the Fujifilm lineup. It's been one of the best lenses, one of the best zoom lenses that I've ever used, and it's really a great, great lens. Now, this lens, from a sharpness perspective, on the 40 megapixel sensor of the X-T40, meaning the most demanding sensor that Fujifilm currently has in their APS-C lineup, does really, really well. It is very, very sharp in the center, wide open at 16 millimeters, while corners are a little bit behind, but they're not bad. It's just that they're not as sharp as the center. As you stop down, the center sharpness doesn't change that much because it's already great when it's wide open, while corners get to a very, very good level at a 5.6 at 16 millimeters. Stopping it down doesn't change the situation that much. And once you get to f11, you start to see some diffraction. At f16, the diffraction is more visible. And f22, the diffraction basically kills the vast majority of the sharpness of the image. But that is kind of normal when on a higher megapixel sensor on the wide end. This is pretty much what you get when it comes to diffraction. As you zoom in, at 23 millimeters, the image is already very, very good corner to corner. And as you stop down to a 5.6, you get spectacular sharpness corner to corner. So very, very good result over there. Same things at 35, while at 55, the lens is very sharp, corner to corner already at f2.8. And if you get to f4, it kicks in an additional level of sharpness, which makes it crazy, crazy, crazy sharp. It's basically perfect when it comes to both sharpness, vignetting, corners, and stuff like that. Purple fringing in general is very well controlled, although it's visible in some specific shots, but you gotta look for it. It's not gonna show that much that you're gonna notice it. You're gonna need to look for that, especially in the corners on very difficult scenes like the one that I'm showing you here. Even the flare is very well controlled. It's not perfect, but no lens is, especially an f2.8 zoom. It's difficult to find an f2.8 zoom that doesn't flare. They all flare. And the one that you get out of this shows a little bit of ghosting, but not dramatically, and it doesn't wash the lens out too much either. So very good performance from a flare perspective there. The longitudinal chromatic aberration is visible, but it's not that much. I mean, it's there, but again, you're gonna have to look for it. Otherwise, in a normal usage, you will not see it. The close focus capabilities with this lens are really good. Not only because you can focus at 30 centimeters throughout the zooming range, but also because this is one of those lenses that you can use wide open at the minimum focusing distance without worrying about the image being hazy. Some lenses, when you use them at the minimum focusing distance, especially wide open, there's just a haze, there's no sharpness to it. This lens, not at all. This lens is basically as good as it is at infinity. Sunstars are really nice, and as you stop down, of course, they get better and better and better. The sweet spot for Sunstars is, of course, f16, because the lens is still sharp enough, and the Sunstars is sharp enough. If you stop down to f22, you get a better defined Sunstar, but the rest of the image is not sharp at all, so it's not usable unless you absolutely need it. But where this lens comes on its own is when it comes to bokeh, because bokeh with this lens is really, really good throughout the zooming range. I find it to be soft, dreamy, a very pleasing way of rendering the bokeh. And it's hard to convey in video, because even compared to the previous version, we're going to talk about that in a second, differences are subtle, but those differences make the overall look of the image much, much, much better. Compared to the previous version, because some of you may be asking about that, I found a weird thing. The new lens has a wider zooming range, meaning that at 16 millimeters is a little bit wider than the predecessor, and at 55 is a little bit tighter than the predecessor. It's not something that will blow your mind. The difference, especially on the wide end, are very minimal, while on the telephoto end they're more visible. But still, something to mention. So you basically have a wider zooming range compared to the previous one. When it comes to image quality, the previous version seems to be a tad better in the corners of wide open at 16 millimeters, while the new version is definitely better at 55 millimeters. However, those differences, aside from pixel peeping, aren't crazy. When it comes to all the rest, they're very similar. The new one has a little bit better Sunstars, but differences are very, very, very minimal. And for all the rest, they're very, very, very similar. From longitudinal chromatic aberration to fringing to flare, the differences are basically negligible, something that you will never notice. So that means that the new lens, from an optical standpoint, is better in some areas than the predecessor, and at the same level of the predecessor, despite being much more contained in size and especially weight. And that is a big, big, big achievement for this lens. Video is where you get the vast majority of the differences with the previous version, the vast majority of the upgrades compared to the previous version, because this lens is finally behaving like a almost perfect hybrid lens. And I say almost for a reason, because what I realized, and I was taking this for granted and I was wrong, the last thing that I tested on this lens was how smooth the aperture was when it was in the declicked position. It was literally the last thing that I tested before wrapping this review up. And I realized that even if it's in the declicked mode, which should get you a smooth aperture change while you're recording a video, well, that doesn't happen. The aperture still moves in steps. Now, I don't know if that can be fixed on a firmware update. I hope they can, but I doubt, because it should have been something that you need to design the lens for, something that has smooth motors for the aperture. I don't know how to explain that. So I'm concerned this cannot be fixed in video. I'm gonna be super happy if I'm proven wrong, but it shouldn't be like that. Like, if you give me the declicked aperture ring, it doesn't need to be declicked for the sake of playing with it. It needs to be declicked because if I'm closing my aperture while I'm recording a video, the aperture needs to move smoothly. So on that, I wasn't happy at all. But aside from the way the aperture behaves when it's in the clicked position, this lens is much better than the predecessor when it comes to video for a lot of reasons. Because finally, Fujifilm has made a lens that you can use zooming in and out without having those exposures adjustment, even if everything is in manual and nothing should be changing, because this lens is a custom F2.8 lens. So if I set it at F2.8 and I zoom in and out and all the other parameters in manual, the exposure shouldn't be changing. Well, with this one is finally happening. With the previous version, it wasn't, and that was something that I hated. And that was kind of in every lenses that Fujifilm has ever done. And also they managed since even if the lens is not parfocal, because you need to design the lens to be parfocal, they finally found a way to make sure that as you zoom in and out while you're recording a video, you don't lose the focus on the subject. That means that they find some trickeries with the autofocus motors, even out of single autofocus, to maintain the focus where it's supposed to be. And that is a good thing, because it gets you the flexibility of using the lens a little bit different than you were used to with other lenses when recording video. Focus transitions are pretty good in this one. They're not perfect, but are definitely better than the predecessor. They're more sure about themselves. It enhance a lot less, and it gets to the point where it's supposed to go in a smoother way. The only area where the predecessor is a tad better than this one is in the focus breathing department, because while the predecessor didn't have pretty much any focus breathing at all, this new lens has a minimal focus breathing at the wider end, while it basically has no focus breathing at all on the telephoto end. But again, when I say minimal, I mean it. A normal use case, you wouldn't even notice. If you're doing the testing for a review, you will look for it and then it's going to show. But it's very minimal. It's still very well controlled. Nonetheless, the predecessor is a little bit better because it basically shows no focus breathing at all. But aside from that, this lens is very good for video. It's not gonna be the lens that is gonna hold you back. If anything, it's gonna be the way you're using the camera, or I don't know, but not the lens. The lens is very good for video. And so in conclusion, this lens is definitely a very good lens. I forgot to mention the autofocus in the previous part of the video. The autofocus works really well. The one thing that you can think of is that the lens is never going to be the reason why you miss a shot. If anything, it's going to be the camera or user error, but not the lens. So this lens is going to be as good as the camera that you're using it with, and as good as you can use the camera. It's fast, it's accurate. I never had any issues, and I took thousands of shots with this lens. So the vast majority of them I cannot show them because it was events, private stuff, personal stuff that I cannot show. But I've shot almost 2,000, 2,500 images with this lens. Autofocus is really good. Now, this is definitely a worthy update to the previous version, because especially at the same price, same recommended price by the manufacturer, the launch price is still $1,200. It's not cheap, but it's the same price that the previous version was launched at basically 10 years ago. Considering the prices have gone up for everything, this is quite an achievement. It's a lens that performs as good as or better than the predecessor in pretty much any aspect, and it does it in a smaller and especially more lightweight package. I can definitely recommend this lens for whoever is looking for an f2.8 standard zoom. This does it all. This is it. And I understand there's some competition here because some may think that the Sigma 18-50 f2.8 is a better option because it's smaller and it's a lot cheaper than this. Or the Tamron 17-70 f2.8 is a better option because it's got a longer zooming range and it's also stabilized. But believe me, none of those lenses comes close to what you get with this lens when it comes to build quality and especially image quality. This lens sits on a league of its own compared to those. The only competition you get from an image quality standpoint is with the previous version. However, despite the fact that this new version is better than the predecessor, especially considering the size and the weight of the lens, does this mean that you're gonna have to rush sell the previous version that you have and go buy the new one? If you were concerned about the size and the weight and you were feeling that those were the reasons why you were leaving your lens home, by all means, go swap them. You're gonna pony up some money, good money, but you're gonna get a lens that is finally usable as an everyday carry. Or if you're a hybrid shooter and you felt like the video performance when it comes to zooming in and out, the fact that it would change its exposure, or the fact that the size and the weight were definitely wearing on you while shooting videos, again, swap them. You're gonna pony up some money, but you're gonna thank yourself for doing that. On the other hand, if you didn't feel like size and weight were a big difference, if you don't feel like the video improvement that you get with this new lens are enough of a reason for you to swap them, you don't have any reason to do the swap because still, today, 10 years after its launch, this previous version is still a great lens. So it's up to you. It's up to what you consider a deal breaker, what you consider the most important thing for you. Of course, if you're starting from scratch and you have the budget, I would have no doubts. There's no competition. This lens is better than anyone else, no matter how you look at it. But if you're on a budget and you don't mind about the size, you can think about purchasing the old version used. You're probably going to get a cheaper deal now that the new lens is out. You have plenty of choices. You have plenty of choices. For me, this 16-55 f2 Mark II is a 100% recommended lens. It's a great lens, and it's going to be the standard for a decade, I guess, in the Fujifilm lineup. Well, guys, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was what you were looking for, and I hope it wasn't too long, but knowing myself, it was. Ciao, and I'll see you in the next one.